Hello.
Our story begins with a what if within a what if. Grand Master Luke Skywalker had seen both the worst and the best of the galaxy. He in this moment was confiding in his sister, Leia Organa Solo. Luke utilized this era of peace and prosperity to build a stronger, newer Jedi Order. One that rose without the flaws of the old sect, but still had its flaws. What lost Luke and what consumed him in this time of tranquility was what they had lost, and if they could actually stop it from happening. The Jedi Master sometimes had nightmares of the Death Star's destruction. It's not that those technological terrors didn't need to be destroyed, it was more of the fact that he had been responsible for killing an entire planet's population with a single torpedo. Not to say Luke wouldn't do it again, because he wouldn't even question it, but he realistically had to look at everything and everyone they lost. Entire planets were destroyed, now left lifeless husks of dust in the galaxy. There had been so much loss because of the Empire, and for what? It was so pointless, so much needless death at that. Leia listened to her brother as he paced around the patio of a high-rise on Coruscant. The two of them did a beautiful job at restoring the Republic and resurrecting the Jedi Order. But what if it didn't come at the sacrifice of so many lives? Leia was honestly lost by this conversation. She and her brother, she thought, reconciled with that past. She thought that they were at peace with what had come and gone, and that they had made the effort to better the galaxy for themselves, their family, and every single soul that lived in it now, for a reason. Luke definitely agreed with this more reserved take, but he was more so thinking about all the good that could have been brought by Palpatine's earlier demise. If he could have just been removed from the galaxy at infancy, or even at his revelation on Naboo, then perhaps all of this could have been prevented. They wouldn't have to worry about their children being seduced to the dark side, or impure remnants popping up whenever there was too much good in the galaxy. It would just be an endless fight to maintain the status quo of the Old Republic and or Jedi Order in the galaxy of old. That was the what if. Leia thought for a moment. She knew that Luke possessed the power to potentially alter history, and she didn't want to give him any ideas. But she understood the sentiment. If they could have the past back, she'd tell her parents that she loved them, and she'd even get the chance to try and know Padme and even eventually Anakin. There was some legitimacy in what they could see or know or even interact with, but that burden would be as equal to what they have now. All of their work to restore the Republic and keep it safe from the Imperial remnants and whatever other foe appeared from the reaches of the galaxy would be for nothing. Their fight would be nearly no different in the past, the only difference being pirate raids and syndicate aggression while trying to muzzle the most popular politician of that modern era in the Old Republic. Leia didn't mean to shoot her brother's idea down, but this one could cost both of them their families, and after everything they'd been through, that wasn't worth the risk in her heart. Not to be selfish to all those who died for the rebellion or prior to Yavin, but they spent their entire lives fighting the Empire too. That was the cost of war, of fighting that kind of government, and each of them had to accept that sometimes letting go is better than trying to change it. Luke understood, and he didn't mean to pry at his sister, but even with her reassurance and a new perspective to view things with, he couldn't help but dwell on the past. It wasn't that Luke was searching for grand adventure or the praise of a war hero. He was merely looking for an avenue to destroy the Sith before Endor, before Palpatine's resurrection. Maybe it wasn't the most feasible plan, but it had some legitimacy to it. Yet there was one thing that Leia mentioned that especially resonated with the Jedi Master. He didn't want to sacrifice his family either. That would be a burden too great for his heart to bear. They had come so far since Yavin. It would be almost pointless to throw all of those years of life away for nothing. Again though, what if it wasn't nothing? What if they could keep their families and destroy the Sith before trillions of lives suffered? That would again keep Luke up all night and pester his thoughts until he returned to his temple. It seemed unreasonable, but Luke couldn't help but use his power for something good, to bring these people back from their untimely deaths. Unfortunately, a major reason this kept Luke up, and even came out in conversation with his sister, was because he figured out how to do it. He knew things wouldn't be the same, but maybe they could be preserved. Luke read enough history since becoming a Jedi Master and learned enough about this time of Force manipulation that he knew how to match all those requirements suggested by Leia, because he calculated for that. But this revealed a continuous problem for the Jedi Order, one that seemed to be an insatiable desire for every Grand Master throughout the ages. The Jedi desired control over the Force and the galaxy in more ways than one. Luke wasn't a villain for trying to save lives or give them a second chance at life, and neither were the Jedi for trying to do what was best. But it highlighted that the great power and influence of the Jedi needed to be kept in check more often than not. It was too great a burden to hold on to so much knowledge and not be able to use it infinitely to bring perfect results to the galaxy. Luke understood the importance of using his Jedi powers for good, as do all Grand Masters, but this was a struggle that even Yoda endured during the waning years of the Republic. This responsibility was important. To do what could or would be best for everyone is what a Jedi should strive for. But sometimes that power becomes too much a responsibility, and Luke, after a few more weeks of dwelling on this problem, did something erratic by his own standards. Instead of transporting himself back in time alone to fix everything, he brought his family with him. Thanks to his perfect concentration and determination, he sent his nephews, niece, friends, sister, and partner to the era of the Fallen Republic. Mara, Leia, Ben, Han, Jason, Anakin, Janna, Lando, and Chewie were sent back in time to the Naboo city of Spinnaker. Master Luke didn't want any of his friends or family getting hurt during the siege of Naboo, and this city, Spinnaker, was on the other side of the planet. They'd be safe from the battle droids there, and they could enjoy the luxury of a beachside urban environment, and he could handle everything on his end. Of course, Luke, due to using almost all of his energy to get everyone back in time, was quite weak when he arrived inside the Palace of Theed. He walked through the towering corridors of a silent royal estate. He avoided stationary battle droids and tried to calm his heart, which was beating out of control. His interest in fixing all the problems with the galaxy became real now. If he failed, he could end up destroying everything his family fought for and died for. But maybe he could make things better. Luke was here before the Battle of Naboo kicked off inside the city. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan were just a little away from him, in the city with the Queen, preparing to make their attack on the palace. But the actual battle hadn't commenced yet. Far from them in the fields, the Gungans were patiently waiting out the AAT barrage. Everything was slowly moving into motion for the battle that would define the future for the Sith. Inside the palace, Luke searched for the first individual to reveal themselves to the Jedi, a Sith, according to legend, named Maul. Luke knew about Sidious and where he could be found, but first, the Grand Master needed to prevent Qui-Gon's death without directly interfering with the Battle of Naboo. He believed that at his current state of energy, he'd be able to fight an eager and young Darth Maul without losing. And fortunately for him, he ran into the Sith assassin, who was biding his time before the Jedi arrived. Maul didn't see Luke, he sensed him, as his master did a galaxy away. The Zabrak's lightsaber ignited when he saw the cloaked Jedi Master. He, instead of resorting to violence, asked what Luke was. The Jedi Master didn't say anything, just ignited an emerald lightsaber. To Maul, this was everything he needed to know to understand his opponent's affiliation, so he rushed him. Skywalker was slow to react. Maul launched in, seizing what seemed to be Luke's exhaustion. Their sabers interlocked, Maul using his physical strength to push Skywalker backwards into a pillar. He didn't hit it hard, but soft, which Maul didn't notice. Luke traded blows without moving from his position, almost seamlessly. He allowed Maul to get comfortable and confident with his control over the fight. Luke continued to block and parry until he ducked out of the way and spun backwards. He deflected a few more strikes, moving away from the hangar bay where Qui-Gon and his party were now arriving. Luke could tell, just by the sound of blaster fire and N-1 starships powering up, that they were here. It was the perfect amount of sound to cover their duel up from the Jedi, and it provided Luke a chance to get Maul away from Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan. Up and around the stairs, the two of them went, into the energy plasma chambers. They crossed a platform above the beaming lights, slinging their weapons at one another. Maul had total control over this until Luke stopped. He parried lightly and powered down with all of his strength in a quick double tap. Maul staggered off the strike immediately, and his smug look disappeared from his face. Skywalker ripped his weapon across the ground, launching sparks through the air. He connected with Maul again, forcing the Sith apprentice to step back and defend himself. Luke was far more experienced in combat than Maul, and at this point, only looking for a chance to end this engagement without dragging it out. Now that Luke had an idea that the two Jedi were joining the Queen to capture the throne room, he didn't need to concern himself with keeping this fight clean. Just as he intended by striking the ground, the platform below them started to wobble. Luke cut most of his support and backflipped to the other side, knowing that the young and aggressive assassin would want to prove his worth against the Jedi warrior. He watched Maul leap forward. Skywalker stepped back, planting his foot and spinning through the air and under Maul's flip. Once the Zabrak's feet hit the ground, Luke's lightsaber exited out of his chest. Maul looked down for a moment before sliding off the weapon and slamming onto the main walkway below them. Luke for a moment frowned, wishing that it didn't need to be this way, but the Sith had to go. From here on out, he'd have to wait. Thanks to his friends and family being safe on the other side of the planet, and no means to contact them with a communication device, he'd need to wait until after the assault to find them. Instead of leaving the site of his duel, he would reach out through the Force to establish a connection, first with Mara, and second with Leia. He needed them to know that they were safe, and that he too was in the past with them. Leia immediately understood what had happened, and she had her own grievances with their brother for taking them here without their permission. But until then, Leia and Mara could both be happy that their families were at the very least safe. Luke had to wait it out, but because Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan had zero Sith-related distractions, they were able to take control over the throne room with very little trouble. It didn't mean that Anakin missed out on joining the battle over Naboo, but he would end up destroying the droid control ship not actually involved in battle. So basically, Anakin's first real war crime. The Jedi and Queen were able to force Nute Gunray to surrender, and then Anakin blew up a ship that had done as Gunray requested, turn all the battle droids off on the surface and surrender. Regardless, the battle was won, and the Federation was without another powerful Lucrehulk. What mattered most for the Jedi was the meeting with Master Skywalker. Though because Luke was a little concerned with meeting his 10-year-old father, he asked to speak with Qui-Gon alone. The two Jedi walked into the plasma chambers where he would describe the details of the duel with Darth Maul, and explain that there were other Sith out in the galaxy, but they would be dealt with after the celebration of Naboo was completed. This interaction wasn't just very weird, but short and to the point. Luke didn't intend to wait around with the rest of the Jedi while Palpatine joined them for a celebration. Not that Luke would be out of control, but he worried that the Sith Lord might figure out his sensitivity to the Force and clock it. He needed to be a surprise to the real opponent here. If Skywalker could silently wipe out the Sith, then perhaps true change could be brought to the Jedi Order and then the galaxy. Qui-Gon found Luke to be very confusing. He killed an assassin, provided all the evidence for his death, and then just vanished. Skywalker understood that he had a reaming from his wife and sister, and he needed to confront that before even trying to address the Sith concern. But Luke also recognized that Mara's and Leia's reactions would be totally valid and understandable. He would take what he deserved because at this point, even after killing Maul, Luke knew it wouldn't be easy to rebuild what they started in the future. Maul's death was just a minor step in the right direction. The following 48 hours would be confusing, not only for Luke's family but for the Jedi. They had security footage from the Naboo power chamber showing the dark-robed Jedi killing a Sith assassin. The Jedi Council had everything they needed to prove the existence of the Sith, though it should be said, they were even more wary of Luke Skywalker than they were of some other Sith Lord. He was a tangible individual, and no Jedi in their height of power wore dark robes like that. Those were Sith colors, and it was enough for the Jedi to question if Qui-Gon was conspiring with a Sith. And while this was a concern, it did have positive ramifications. Yoda decided to bring young Skywalker into the Jedi Order to protect him. Despite retiring as a personal instructor, the Grand Master promised to himself and the Council that he would train Anakin. They saw his potential, and they feared what he could become if a Sith trained him. So in many ways, Anakin was only being trained out of fear. To keep an eye on the ever-so-suspicious Qui-Gon, Master Depa Billaba would be assigned to watch him, or what they called shadow him. At the same time as all of this, they would knight Obi-Wan Kenobi and prepare for their return to Coruscant with Maul's body and lightsaber. Sidious now had to figure out a new strategy. Luckily for him, he sensed something prior to making a massive decision, and thus had more resources at his disposal on Coruscant. Even though Luke didn't know that, he was still listening to his friends who took up various problems with his actions. Lando had a very nice lady friend that he was sure might go further than a couple fun, expensive dates. Leia was reasonably pissed off because all of her legislative work no longer existed. Entire years of understanding her peers and mastering counters to effectively get them on her side was gone, though she was willing to see that at least she knew the history of the Senate. Thanks to her father Bail, her memory was filled with everything he taught her about the imperial era of the Senate. Sure, some of these senators and representatives were a bit different and evolved by the time of the Empire, but she knew how to best influence the Old Republic Senate and their representatives. All she needed was time, but there was really nothing defending Luke's actions. He made a terrible mistake in all of their eyes. Despite the adults all taking up their own reasonable problems with their friend, brother, or husband, the children were all kind of fine with this change. Some of the Jedi were upset that they had to forget their friends from the past, but they were all young adults. Their lives weren't fully started yet. They had the chance, respectively, to take advantage of this new era because they hadn't totally forged their own futures yet. They were young enough to strive for better futures with tons of good energy, but old enough to still be remorseful that they had to say goodbye. The main thing is, for Ben, Anakin, Jason, and Jannah, was that they didn't build their lives around changing the future. They grew up in its reconstruction, but they also all knew the history of the Old Republic, so this was technically their chance to live it, and bend it to work for each of them respectively, which could go positively. At the end of those 48 hours though, Luke was ready to continue his efforts. He promised his family that he could make things work, that everything would work out, but that wasn't the problem again. Their collective problem wasn't that they could make things right, it's that they had already made things right and now had to hope that it wasn't just beginner's luck. But at the end of a long line of apologies and promises, Luke left with their grace to do what he promised he was going to do. This actually put Luke into a really bad headspace. He went into what he believed to be his final fight with the Sith in the mindset that he could destroy them in one go. This was an important duel coming up. If he could kill Sidious, then the Empire would never rise, and even better, the galaxy would be set free from the Sith. It was a win-win in his book. Sure, the Jedi were still problematic and the Senate had its issues, but he could nearly guarantee success because he had seen the past. Master Skywalker arrived at the works in the industrial sector late into the evening. His energy returned to him, and he was prepared to extinguish the lineage of the Sith in this forgotten building. Once they were gone, the future would be freed from the curse of the Sith Order. Luke entered the structure silently, landing on the outskirts and then venturing in, the same way he had the first time he visited this lair. Obviously, the last time he was here, back after Endor, things were different. By that time, the structure caved in due to the rust. Luke, with his robes above his head, snuck through the building and listened to a ritualistic seance in another room. It had to be Palpatine. He must be searching for Darth Maul. What happened to his apprentice? The Jedi never actually disclosed what happened behind closed doors, because Qui-Gon never died, so Palpatine must have had to assume the worst. Luke's hand hovered over his lightsaber, and he slipped into the alchemic room. He could feel the emanating darkness. It covered his body, and yet he didn't allow it into his skin. Skywalker felt something like this before, because of what he experienced on the Death Star. His saber found his hand and ignited. The Sith Lord behind the altar hissed and flipped the actual podium, dumping blue fire onto the floor. Through the flames walked a towering Sith Lord, one who was spared by a sense that Sidious felt. A crimson lightsaber lifted up, revealing the face of a Mun Sith Lord. Luke felt a chill roll down his spine as he realized that Plagueis the Wise hadn't been killed, and it was because Sidious spared him, sensing a change in the very Force before Luke even arrived in the past. They moved towards each other as Plagueis called the young Jedi a fool for tracing him to his lair. Their lightsabers rolled into battle. Neither of them moved from position. They traded strikes and blocks with their feet planted into the floor. This was more than a duel for the light and the dark, but one of mastery and technique. Skywalker thrusted his hand forward and Plagueis slid across the floor back through the fire. Luke rushed him, batting his weapon upwards and across the lengthy Sith Lord. Plagueis was skilled enough and speedy enough to move his weapon into the proper parries and deflections. Despite Luke's skill, Plagueis was experienced enough to protect himself. As their blades continued to bob around the dark room, another lightsaber ignited. Sidious, after all day in the Senate, returned to his quote-unquote master to discuss moving forward with Tyrannus, and he was shocked by a lightsaber duel. He rushed in. Even if he was going to kill his master the other day, defeating a Jedi was always more important. Skywalker sensed Palpatine before he heard the ignition of the lightsaber, and he quickly rolled beneath the strike by Plagueis. He blocked Palpatine, stopping two separate sabers from touching him at once. With the Force, Luke bent backwards and planted his hand on the ground, kicking upwards. Palpatine flipped through the air and landed beside Plagueis. The two of them pulled their sabers up into their formed positions and moved in. Skywalker backed up for a second, harmonizing with the Force through the darkness, and then moved in. He didn't let their numbers threaten him, and he attacked first, catching both Sith off guard. Their overconfidence against the likes of a modern Jedi confused them, because they would have expected any other Jedi of this order to be defensive, but Luke was no modern Jedi. He cut between them, bouncing his sabers between theirs in rapid succession, as if he could see their moves before they even made them. He was truly a master at the saber. Plagueis and Sidious wouldn't be beat through saber combat though. They may have disliked the Jedi for their over-reliance on the blade, but they knew all the forms like the back of their hands. They kept Luke on his toes, but even though this was a fight to the death, there was something special about this for Skywalker. For a Jedi whose masters seldomly taught him to wield a blade, he was going toe-to-toe with the greatest Sith of the last millennium. They were impressive duelists and Force users, but he was a nobody kid from Tatooine that didn't just rebuild the Jedi Order, but was holding his own against the likes of Plagueis the Wise and Darth Sidious. It was a nice moment for Luke, even if it came in the middle of their duel. After the thought passed, he shoved his saber forward and created a Force projection of himself with the blast of Force Light. It was a light side power that illuminated the light itself and purged the darkness. For individuals or Darksiders like Plagueis and Sidious, it wouldn't remove their connection to the dark side, but it would disorient them momentarily, which it did. Like Vapad, this specific power was created intentionally to counter Darksiders, and as it was designed, they were confused for long enough of a time for Luke to single out Palpatine and allow his apparition to fight Plagueis. The Sith Lord responsible for the Galactic Empire was caught flat-footed, and Skywalker shoved him back into the fire and kept him there. It was long enough of a moment for Sidious's robes to ignite. He allowed the pain to fuel him, but it continued to be a distraction. On the other hand, Luke's projection slipped and avoided every single strike. But thanks to the actual collision of sabers between Sidious and Luke, Plagueis assumed that this Jedi was actually fighting him, instead of Palpatine. It was so confusing to both Sith. Even Sidious wasn't sure if he was fighting the real Jedi or not. But Skywalker didn't stop until Palpatine's hand was removed and his neck was sliced, which killed him nearly instantly. Plagueis was distracted, until he cut through Luke's apparition and turned back to have his eye sliced upwards. His face ripped open and the Jedi Master towered over the Mun Sith Lord, who fell backwards against the rough floor. Skywalker didn't puff his chest, he just prepared to kill the last of the Sith. He could feel it. This was his moment to destroy them and save the galaxy from the Empire, and just as he readied his blade, Plagueis with the last of his strength released pure force from himself. He didn't try any unique powers, he didn't focus on anything. This was a pure desperation Hail Mary because he didn't have a counter for the Jedi Master. The blast extinguished every light in the room, including Luke's lightsaber, and even knocked him backwards. By the time Luke reignited his weapon, his opponent was gone. Sidious was left for dead, and there remained another Sith. The history books were wrong. Sidious lied about the day he killed Plagueis, and Luke had, to a degree, failed. But this was perhaps a better timeline already. Removing Palpatine from the picture already prevented the Empire from rising. So theoretically, this was probably the best case scenario that made Luke feel infinitely better. Because this was important, Luke would travel to the Jedi Temple to inform them of what he had done. Temple guards would temporarily arrest this mysterious figure, and he would tell them the truth, as he had Qui-Gon, and then he would reveal the nature of the Sith once again, this time with a full understanding that he had accidentally let a Sith escape. But he killed his apprentice. Once the Sith conducted their own investigation and learned that Luke wasn't lying to them, they allowed him to tell them everything he knew. So Master Skywalker, Grand Master of the New Jedi Order, told the old High Council the truth of his past and the present. And while they could retain and listen to this information, there was very little they could actually do to discover Plagueis. And unfortunately for everyone, Luke didn't know much about the Sith Lord before Palpatine. Sidious rarely discussed his old master in any of his journals. All he ever did was cite the work that Plagueis did and try to replicate it, which, in all fairness, Luke had seen Palpatine do before. Without knowledge on where this Mun Sith Lord went, or his actual name, his real name not Plagueis, the Jedi were left to continue hunting for Plagueis. At the same time, because the Jedi started to actually trust Luke, they'd help Leia and her family get situated on Alderaan, where she'd be able to approach Bail and Breha Organa. Though things would never be the same because they didn't raise her. They never did, and they knew nothing of what she had been through. It made things even more painful for Leia because all of their memories of her no longer existed. It was almost soulless, yet it did provide her a chance to make a bid for senator. Due to Bail Tilly's losing the election to Palpatine a few days before, he put his name in for retirement. He couldn't just rescind it after it was confirmed that Palpatine died, so Alderaan would need to put a new candidate up for election. Leia knew all of her father's moves, but she didn't know she could just challenge Bail Organa. He was a widely loved local politician. She'd be a no-name candidate running with a very similar last name and a history that no one could technically trace back to Alderaan. Han Solo, though, her very loving husband, encouraged her to keep going with it though. Even if she didn't win, her name would be recognized by the people, and she still might be able to make a difference on the local level. The important thing, from Han's perspective, was to get Leia back into politics again. She was struggling mentally with the whole time travel thing, and yes, Han had his issues with Luke for that too, but his priority was to make sure Leia and his children were okay first, which is what he focused on here at Alderaan. The biggest case for him pleading this to Leia too was that she could actually finally represent her own people. Alderaan could actually be represented by Leia, not some other planet she wasn't born on. Luke, at the same time, after clearing Qui-Gon's name, participated in Jedi expeditions to search for Plagueis. In doing this, he brought Mara and Ben along. They willingly agreed to join him, but it was a little hard. They not only gave up their entire lives in the old galaxy, but they were now participating in trying to fix what had become their new lives, ones they didn't choose. There certainly was a growing divide between Luke and his family, even with Mara. He so desperately wanted to save more lives, which was, yes, valid, but also he was distancing himself from those closest to him just to do it. Everyone was valid for their feelings, which was the worst part of the situation. The Skywalker Solo family was entirely valid for wanting to remain in their own time period. They spent their entire lives building what they had. But if Luke was successful, he would not only save billions of innocent civilians from losing their lives to the Death Stars, the Empire, and Darth Vader, but he'd be protecting billions of Imperial loyalists from falling for propaganda and Imperial lies. Yet even Luke noticed and felt this growing divide in his family. Sometimes it felt like everything would fall apart if he didn't act quickly and destroy Plagueis. But alas, the Sith worked quickly, and even before Skywalker could address the Dooku problem, Tyrannus was gone and in the shadows too. It surprisingly didn't take a long time for the Sith to reveal themselves. See, Plagueis came to the understanding that the Jedi he fought wasn't from their time. No, he didn't assume time travel or anything, he just knew that the individual didn't come directly from the Council because there was no way for them to have grown such intelligence. All jokes aside, Plagueis gutted former Jedi Master Dooku for betraying the Sith. He assumed that the loose end that sent that Jedi Master on him and Palpatine had to be Palpatine's little Jedi traitor, Dooku. But because Plagueis was now without a plan, and the Republic was without a Chancellor, he decided to throw everything at the wall and hope it stuck. This wasn't a stupid idea per se, but he was just in a special position right now. The Senate was discombobulated and turned in on itself. No one could agree on a replacement for Palpatine, especially after so many just turned on Valorum. Thanks to Newt Gunray's arrest, the Federation was weaker than before, and Plagueis simply rolled into their headquarters on Cato Neimoidia and gave them one direction. Anyone who opposed him were choked to death, and those who listened were spared. Plagueis had a long-established relationship with the Federation, dating back to the end of the High Republic. He knew how many assets they had and how to disperse them evenly. So instead of a Sith revelation with clones and battle droids, the Federation simply turned on the galaxy, because Plagueis could seize control of something in the chaos. He knew that it would come, he just didn't know how yet. Battleships appeared over planets, droids marched through the streets, and the Jedi were forced to deploy as a reactive force, with whatever minor militias and local navies were available. Luke had to take this one on the chin. From behind him and around him, his friends from the future were left in disappointment. The tragedy is, everyone knew the Federation, even at its height, wouldn't incur as many casualties as the Empire, but Luke traded one war for another. He simply, through action, said that some lives are more important than others. It was soul-crushing for Luke, and his expedition to find Plagueis with the heroes of the old Jedi abandoned him for these pressing matters of defending civilians. Skywalker was left in disappointment with himself, and while he was still determined to find the Sith Lord and destroy him, he couldn't help but reflect on his actions. This power wielded by the Jedi needed to be limited. He fell for the age-old trap of trying to do more beyond his own limitations. Luke saved the galaxy once with the help of his friends, and there was no reason to now have dragged them into another war that never needed to be. The Federation was an aggressor unlike anything the Jedi of this current era had seen in their recent history. Leia on Alderaan decided that even in her frustration, that she would try and run for public office. Maybe not as a favorite on her home world, but with the vision of war and knowing how to move through it, she was able to politically outsmart her own father, who lacked the experience she had after a life full of conflict. It was a true wake-up call for Luke. He wasn't alone, but this was his error, and he needed to make it right. Luckily for him, despite the Jedi reaction taking them across the stars, Luke assumed that his foe would be with the Federation at their headquarters, and yes, Plagueis would be. Surprisingly, just to make sure that they remained dedicated to their plan for galactic war, the Sith Lord only wanted to sow chaos and leave once the Federation forces were defeated. Plagueis knew that this strategy wouldn't award him total victory. That wasn't the plan, because even if the Republic had no military, the Federation wouldn't win galactically, wouldn't win galaxy-wise. There was no feasible way for them to win. They were just a single sacrifice to upset the status quo until the Sith could return with his new, non-backstabbing apprentice, whoever they might be. When Luke arrived at the headquarters on Cato Neimoidia, he broke into the main facility with very little issue. The Jedi didn't concern themselves with the headquarters because their habits always revolved around plugging holes rather than solving the full issue at hand. Plagueis rightly assumed the Jedi would react to the attacked locations around the galaxy, rather than the capital of the Federation. Luke obviously was a different Jedi who thought outside the box for 3 seconds, and he was merely here to threaten leadership and end their assault. Plagueis was very displeased when the black-robed Jedi entered the command center for all Federation operations here. Skywalker wasn't even hesitant about his approach. He with the Force locked every single window and door while igniting his weapon. The Sith Lord watched Luke. The Jedi Master was very precise with his movements, almost evoking the actions of his father Mustafar. Luke wasn't diving into the dark side, but it felt like it. Plagueis felt that it was very misleading because even Luke felt like a dark acolyte for a few moments. He could feel the hatred, yet he simply watched Luke get closer to him. There was so much tension. Plagueis survived Luke before, and theoretically he could do it again. His hand hovered over his lightsaber as Luke watched every control panel, waiting for whatever inevitable trap the Sith set for him. They were so well known for their misdirection, surely something was coming for Luke. Plagueis watched the holo table bob with lights and holograms as new assaults began and more planets fell under the attack of the Federation. The Sith Lord readied his weapon, and as Luke raised his saber, there remained no response from Plagueis, until his body dropped to the ground lifelessly. To Luke, it seemed like there was no plan, and maybe there wasn't. The truth is, he couldn't tell. There was no triumphant duel to end the Sith. There was no final stand. From what Luke could tell, there was no essence transfer or attempt to flee, and that was perhaps the most disorienting and unsatisfying aspect of Plagueis' demise. Luke wanted to win like he had before. The Sith or the Empire always came with some new fight, but Plagueis didn't. He didn't try and pretend that anything he would do would make a difference. Maybe he tried to escape via essence transfer, and maybe there was some grand plan to it, but Luke felt even worse after killing Plagueis, because maybe the Sith Lord bet everything he had on the fact that a Jedi wouldn't kill an innocent Sith, even if that Sith was actively hurting others. Truthfully, everything about this was very un-Jedi. Luke won, but almost at what cost? He would shut down the battle droids, yet victory felt worthless. He didn't just spare lives, he costed others theirs. The death toll hadn't been released, but when those numbers hit, they'd be devastating. Millions of casualties, tens of millions injured or wounded, worlds devastated, supply chains upset, food shortages to come, and so forth. And maybe the Federation only did all that in a few days, but it was enough to make the galaxy hurt, and it was enough for Luke to reel from his actions, despite being congratulated by both the Jedi and the public as a hero. That was a burden that he didn't have to deal with during the Galactic Civil War, because he didn't directly cause that conflict. This was a butterfly effect of his own doing. Once the Republic was able to earnestly address the Federation and its assault on the galaxy, Luke was able to breathe again. The truth is, and the worst part is, theoretically he made the right decision by changing the timeline. He saved billions of lives. People now that wouldn't die because of the Sith or the Empire. The Sith themselves were completely destroyed, and the Jedi were actively working to make sure that would remain the case. But there was always a guilt. His family chastised him, not in a condescending way, not in a prove you wrong kind of way. They were just hurt that he put this unbelievable burden on himself, and then dragged them down for it. There was no reason for him to do that. His father's actions were not his to undo, and while he had undone them, he now had to live with his own mistakes, and that was a burden that ate away at him, more than the deaths of any of those he killed on the Death Star. Because these were people that didn't die serving an empire. These were everyday mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, and family members or friends that died because he couldn't kill a Sith. Even though he burdened the galaxy with a Federation assault, there was still much work to be done. Luckily, there were people familiar with conflict, and how to rise above it. It wasn't done begrudgingly either. Even if Leia and Han or Mara were upset with Luke for bringing them back to the galaxy, they still did their part. They all loved him and forgave him at some point, but in the years that followed the Federation's uprising, they would once again see the benefit of their hard work. Leia's time in the Senate, which ended up beating out her own father for Alderaan Senator, led to a short stint as Supreme Chancellor. Lando and Han found work in reconstruction efforts, and even the creation of a small, unified Republic military. In some ways, their joint operation would be easier than it was following the fall of the Empire. In other ways, not. Like, for example, instead of actual war with the Remnants, They had to take down powerhouse conglomerates inside the Senate. But the end result for the Skywalker solo family would be the same: triumph. Inside the Jedi Order, Luke operated as an off-site Boken Jedi Master, someone who worked in cooperation with the High Council but led a smaller sect of the Order. Individuals like Qui-Gon and Quinlan would find themselves inside this unit of the Jedi Order. They practiced what were considered outlandish ideas to the Council, and they did so successfully. Over the years, Luke would see open-minded Jedi like Plo Koon, Kit Fisto, Shak Ti, Dappa Balaba, and Caleb Doom join his ranks. Luke and Leia avoided interaction with their father throughout his adolescence, but they did become friendly with the Senator of Naboo as she ascended the ranks of the Senate. Padme became a great and close friend to the two of them, and while she would never end up marrying Anakin in this timeline, she and Skywalker also remained decent friends. That was a little weird for Luke and Leia because they technically shouldn't exist, but they came before, so maybe too convoluted to worry about. But their relationships with their parents were more tangible than ever before, even the one that Leia built up with Bail and Breya on Alderaan. By the time they reached the point in history when they left their own galaxy, they had changed the Republic for the better, and in the end, only millions died, and the Sith were completely extinguished from the galaxy. No longer did they exist, and no longer did their chaotic influence seep into the minds and hearts of the vulnerable. As Luke hoped, though, all the Jedi that called his order home in the past found refuge in the order he spent what could be considered a lifetime constructing here in the present. That, like Leia's reconstructed Republic, would be the thrill of both their lives. It was a beginning founded in disagreement, but through even harder and more arduous work, with a side of failure, Luke and Leia found a way to not only completely change the galaxy for the better, but do so without the rise of an evil empire. And that, my friends, is a twisted story. Special thanks to all the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash that like button. Sith Clone Wars is out. First episode is yesterday. Next episode, 32, out on Saturday. Otherwise, let's talk about the story. So, I've done a couple of these Luke time travel stories, and usually they're him making the selfless sacrifice. And that element still exists in this story, but I thought it would make more sense if there was an added moral dilemma. Like, the B plot is Luke brings his whole family with him, and they're kind of like, WTF, dude, why did you do that? And he's like, well, we could save billions of lives, but there's also no guarantee of that. And I thought this would probably be the perfect story to address that, because you're going back to the beginning. Obviously, I brought Plagueis back. He wasn't supposed to survive that long, but I changed that little tidbit of the lore just to add some extra dynamic to that guilt that Luke feels. But I thought it made sense for this dilemma to appear, because Luke isn't just sacrificing himself, he's sacrificing everyone with him. And him changing the timeline changes everything they spent 20, 30, 40 years working towards, right? And I think Leia and Mara and Han would all be reasonably upset with him, and they should feel entitled to be upset at him because he did it without their permission. He's just like, I'm gonna go back in time. And they're like, wait, what? And then they wake up and they're back in time. So I thought that extra dilemma would be really good for this. I also do kind of like the idea of you guys coming away from the story like, was Luke right or was he not right? Technically he is. He does technically spare billions to trillions of people from dying, but is he right to have done that? Because all those people were sacrificed so their future would be better in the past, technically. So I kind of like that idea where it's just kind of like more of a discussion in the comments for you guys to be like, well, is it? I kind of lean towards Luke because he did save more, but I'm also totally in understanding with everyone else for being upset at him for like uprooting their lives and so forth. So I thought that'd be an interesting dynamic. I hope you guys enjoyed this story. I love you all, spread the love, and always mind my friends. May the Force be with you.